The most famous organization you have completely wrong. The Knights Templar might be the most mythologized institution in Western history. They appear in Dan Brown novels protecting the bloodline of Jesus. They appear in video games as shadowy puppet masters of civilization. They appear in conspiracy theories as the secret founders of Freemasonry, the guardians of the Holy Grail, the architects of the New World Order, and at least 3 other things depending on which corner of the internet you visit. They appear in serious historical writing as the first multinational banking institution, as the most effective military organization of the crusading era, and as the victims of one of the most spectacular judicial frame-ups in medieval history. Most of what you think you know about the Knights Templar is wrong. The actual story is stranger, more interesting, and considerably more tragic than any of the mythology, and it tells you as much about medieval finance and royal desperation as it does about crusading faith. Start with what they actually were, which is something almost nobody explains properly. 9 Knights and a problem with pilgrim safety. The commonly cited founding story of the Templars goes like this. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. The Crusaders had conquered Jerusalem in 1099, but the roads between the coast and the Holy City were genuinely dangerous. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem were being robbed and killed in significant numbers by bandits operating in the hills between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Hugues proposed that a small group of knights take vows of poverty and chastity like monks, but serve as military escorts for pilgrims, rather than retreating to a monastery. Baldwin gave them quarters in what was believed to be the ancient Temple of Solomon, hence the name, Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, later shortened to Knights Templar, and the order began. The founding story has problems. For roughly a decade after their establishment, the Templars appear to have had only around 9 members. 9 knights cannot adequately patrol the roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem. They were not actually doing much pilgrim protection in those early years. What they were doing is less clear. Some historians suggest the founding story was largely a post hoc construction, designed to give the organization a respectable, charitable mission, and that the real activity in the early years was something more like intelligence gathering and political networking by a group of well-connected French knights with access to the Jerusalem court. This is speculative, but the numbers do not add up for the stated mission. 9 knights is a dinner party, not a security force. What changed everything was the Council of Troyes in 1129, where Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the 12th century, endorsed the Templars, helped write their rule, and produced a famous letter called In Praise of the New Knighthood, that essentially made the Templar project theologically respectable. Bernard's argument was that a monk who fought was not committing violence but performing a service to God, that killing for Christ was not murder but an act of righteousness. This was not an uncontroversial position. It reframed the relationship between Christian ethics and military violence in a way that had enormous consequences for how crusading was understood and practiced. With Bernard's backing, the Templars attracted donations, recruits, and papal privileges at extraordinary speed. The financial revolution nobody credits them with. Within a generation of the Council of Troyes, the Templars had become one of the wealthiest organizations in Europe, and they had invented something that functioned very much like modern banking. The core problem they were solving was practical. A pilgrim traveling from France to Jerusalem needed money for the journey. Carrying large sums of gold or silver was dangerous. You were likely to be robbed, you might be killed, and even if you survived, the logistics of carrying coinage across Europe and the Mediterranean were burdensome. The Templars had a solution. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in France and receive a coded letter of credit. On arriving in the Holy Land, they could present that letter at a Templar facility and receive the corresponding funds in local currency. The transfer happened through the Templar network rather than through physical transportation of coin. This was not exactly the same as a modern letter of credit, and historians debate how sophisticated the system actually was and how widely it was used. But the functional similarity to banking is real. The Templars were moving value across long distances through an institutional network rather than through the physical movement of assets. They extended credit to crusading monarchs. Richard I of England used Templar financial services during the Third Crusade. They managed the financial administration of entire kingdoms. Philip IV of France, as we will get to, essentially used the Templar Paris Temple as a royal treasury. They also became major landowners across Europe. Donations of land and property from nobles who wanted spiritual merit or who were heading off on crusade and wanted their estates managed properly accumulated into a substantial economic base. By the late 13th century, the Templars owned properties across France, England, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and the Levant, operated farms, mills, and vineyards, and were one of the most economically significant institutions in Western Christendom. This wealth was meant to fund crusading activity. The ideal Templar was a warrior monk whose poverty as an individual was sustained by the collective wealth of the order, which was channeled into military operations in the Holy Land. Whether the wealth was actually being used for this purpose was a question that critics raised with increasing frequency as the 13th century wore on and the crusading project ran into mounting difficulties. What the Templars were actually like. The romantic image of the Templar is a white-robed warrior of perfect piety, fighting for Christ in the burning sun of Palestine, with a combination of martial skill and monastic discipline. The historical reality was more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. The Templars were organized into three categories: knights, who were the warrior class and who had to be of noble birth; sergeants, who were of common birth and served as infantry and support troops; and chaplains, who handled the religious functions. The knights wore the famous white mantle with the red cross. Sergeants wore black or brown. The order was headed by a Grand Master, elected by senior members and answerable, at least in theory, to the Pope rather than to any secular monarch. In practice, the Templars in the Holy Land were deeply embedded in the political life of the crusading states, which were constantly fractured by factional disputes among noble families, competing interests between different crusading orders, and arguments about strategy and priorities. The Templars had their own institutional interests that did not always align with the broader crusading project. They fought alongside the Hospitallers, but they also feuded with the Hospitallers repeatedly over territory, jurisdiction, and precedence. They made pragmatic truces with Muslim rulers when it suited them, which earned them accusations of treachery from crusaders who expected unconditional holy war. The Battle of the Horns of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin destroyed the combined military forces of the crusading states and opened the way for his reconquest of Jerusalem, resulted in part from strategic decisions that the Templars and other military orders had argued against. The Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort pushed for a march across waterless terrain in summer heat that ended in disaster. The Templars and Hospitallers captured at Hattin were executed on Saladin's orders, which was unusual. He generally ransomed noble prisoners, suggesting that the military orders were regarded as particularly dangerous enemies rather than as standard ransom opportunities. After the loss of Jerusalem and the partial recovery of the Third Crusade, the Templars continued operating from Acre, the remaining major crusader port on the Palestinian coast. As the crusading states contracted, the Templars fought increasingly desperate rearguard actions. The fall of Acre in 1291, which effectively ended the crusader presence in the Levant, left the military orders without a primary military mission and without their raison d'etre in the Holy Land. Philip IV and the setup of the century. Here is where the story gets genuinely ugly, and where it tells you more about medieval royal finance than about crusading ideology. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was by the early 1300s in severe financial difficulties. He had been fighting expensive wars, had debased the currency, had expelled the Jews from France and seized their assets, and had been in prolonged conflict with Pope Boniface VIII over the taxation of French clergy. He was creative and ruthless in finding revenue, and by 1307 he had identified a new target: the Templars. On the 13th of October, 1307, in a coordinated operation that required keeping the plans secret from most of the French government until the moment of execution, Philip's agents arrested essentially every Templar in France simultaneously. The arrests were carried out on charges of heresy that had been prepared in advance and that included a list of accusations. The Templars denied Christ during their initiation ceremonies, they spat on the cross, they worshipped an idol called Baphomet, they engaged in obscene kisses, they practiced sodomy, they absolved sins without priestly authority. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence for this is substantial. The confessions, which were extracted under torture, were inconsistent with each other and inconsistent with any coherent picture of what the Templars supposedly believed or practiced. The idol Baphomet, which features prominently in subsequent conspiracy theories and occult imagery, was described differently by different prisoners under torture, in ways that suggest people describing something they had been told to confess, rather than something they had actually seen. Templar brothers outside France, in England, Portugal, and Germany, when investigated by local authorities, generally showed no evidence of the practices described in the French confessions. The specific charges also fit suspiciously neatly with the standard toolkit of medieval heresy accusations. Spitting on the cross, denying Christ, and sodomy were the accusations regularly deployed against groups targeted for persecution, Jews, Cathars, and others, because they were inherently difficult to disprove and struck at the core of Christian identity. Philip's legal team was drawing on established frameworks for delegitimizing a target rather than reporting actual discovered practices. What Philip actually wanted was the Templar assets. He owed the Templars money. He had been using the Paris Temple as a royal treasury. He had, some historians argue, already been turned down for the position of Grand Master of a merged military order that would have given him the personal control over Templar resources he desired. Eliminating the Templars was the most direct solution to a financial problem. Pope Clement V, who was French, who had been installed with Philip's support, and whose papacy was based at Avignon rather than Rome, partly because of French royal influence, was in no position to offer effective resistance. He attempted some procedural resistance, insisting on papal control of the trials and sending his own investigators. His investigators in England and elsewhere found little evidence of the French accusations. But the momentum of the French process was too strong, and Clement ultimately went along with what Philip needed: the trial, the confessions, and Jacques de Molay. The trials that followed the 1,307 arrests lasted for 7 years and were among the most extensive judicial proceedings of the medieval period. They involved hundreds of witnesses, multiple papal commissions, and testimony from Templar brothers across Europe. The picture that emerged from the non-French testimony was of a military religious organization with the usual range of human flaws: arrogance, factional disputes, financial self-interest, occasional corruption, but no evidence of systematic heresy. The French testimony, extracted under torture, gave Philip what he needed. The specific initiation ceremony that featured most prominently in the accusations involved new recruits being required to deny Christ and spit on the cross. Some Templars, even those who later recanted their confessions, acknowledged that some version of an unusual initiation ceremony existed. The most sympathetic interpretation of this, offered by some historians, is that the ceremony involved a simulated or symbolic denial intended to prepare initiates for the possibility of being captured by enemies and pressured to apostatize, a genuine risk for crusading knights. This explanation is not universally accepted and may be rationalization after the fact. What is clear is that the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who was in his 60s at the time of his arrest and had been Grand Master since 1298, initially confessed under torture, recanted before a papal commission in 1308, and then confessed again. After years of imprisonment and procedural delay, he was brought out in March 1314 to make a public confession in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Instead, he and another senior Templar, Geoffrey de Charny, publicly recanted their confessions, declared the order innocent, and stated that their only crime had been to have falsely confessed to save themselves from torture. Philip had them burned as relapsed heretics the same day. The Council of Vienne had formally dissolved the Templar order in 1312, with its assets theoretically going to the Hospitallers, though Philip managed to intercept substantial portions of what was in France. The legend that de Molay cursed Philip and Clement from the fire, declaring they would join him before God within a year, is appealing and has been repeated for centuries. Clement died about a month later. Philip died in a hunting accident at the end of the year. Neither death was particularly mysterious given medieval life expectancy and the dangers of hunting. The curse story is probably a later addition to a story that was already dramatic enough without it: the assets, the inheritance, and the long aftermath. The formal dissolution of the order raised an immediate practical question: what happened to the Templars' enormous property holdings across Europe? The official answer was that everything went to the Hospitallers. The practical answer was considerably messier. In France, Philip kept much of what he had seized. In England, Edward II conducted his own investigation, found little evidence of heresy, but eventually went along with the dissolution under pressure and transferred English Templar properties to the Hospitallers, minus various deductions and debts. In Portugal, the Templars were essentially reconstituted under a new name, the Order of Christ, with the same members, the same properties, and the same basic function, which suggests that Portuguese authorities considered the French accusations nonsense. In Scotland, where papal authority was weak due to the ongoing conflict with England, the dissolution was implemented partially at best, and some Templars appear to have simply continued operating informally. The Order of Christ in Portugal went on to become one of the key institutional backers of the Portuguese Age of Discovery. Vasco da Gama sailed to India under the Cross of Christ on his sails, a direct visual descendant of the Templar Red Cross. This is one of those historical continuities that sounds like conspiracy theory, but is actually just documented institutional history. The Hospitallers, who received the official transfer of Templar property, were not able to actually take possession of much of it because Philip had already moved aggressively and because local administrators had in many cases absorbed the properties into other uses. The Hospitallers emerged from the whole episode significantly worse off than they might have expected, as the theoretical inheritors of one of the wealthiest organizations in Europe. The mythology machine and why it never stops. The Templars became mythologically productive almost immediately after their suppression, and they have never stopped being mythologically productive in the 7 centuries since. The combination of their sudden disappearance, their obvious wealth, the dramatic finale of de Molay's retraction and execution, and the widespread suspicion that the charges against them were fabricated, created a narrative vacuum that imagination filled. Where did the Templar treasure go? Some assumed it was hidden. The answer is almost certainly that there was no hidden treasure. Philip seized most of the French assets. The English and other assets went to the Hospitallers or local nobles, and the organization's wealth was in land and property rather than in portable gold. But the hidden treasure story was more satisfying. The connection to Freemasonry, which became standard in the 18th century, was largely invented by French Freemasons, who found it useful to claim ancient origins through the Templars. There is no credible historical evidence of organizational continuity between the medieval Templars and 18th century Freemasonry. The connection is symbolic and rhetorical, not institutional. The Holy Grail connection, the bloodline of Christ, the Priory of Sion. These are 19th and 20th century constructions that accumulated around the Templar legend. The Priory of Sion, which features in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code as an ancient organization, was actually founded in 1956 by a French eccentric named Pierre Plantard, who forged documents to give it fake historical depth. The forgeries were exposed. The organization is not ancient. None of this has significantly affected the Priory of Sion's presence in popular consciousness. The Templars are genuinely interesting without any of this. The actual history contains financial innovation, military tragedy, religious devotion that was real, even when it was also institutionally self-interested, a judicial atrocity that was documented in contemporaneous sources and has been analyzed by historians for centuries, and a set of consequences that shaped Portuguese exploration, Hospitaller history, and European royal finance. That story does not require a secret treasure or a bloodline of Christ to be worth understanding. What the Templars were and what their destruction means. The Knights Templar were, at their peak, an organization that had done something genuinely unusual. They had built a multinational institution with real administrative coherence, financial sophistication, and military effectiveness, funded by voluntary donation and organized around a religious mission. The wealth that accumulated was the byproduct of that institutional success, not the original goal. Their destruction was not caused by their heresy, because the heresy was fabricated. It was caused by the intersection of royal financial desperation, the specific vulnerability created by having no territorial base after the loss of the Holy Land, and the particular political weakness of a pope who owed his position to the king who wanted the Templars gone. Philip IV needed money and had the power to take it. The Templars had money and lacked the political protection to keep it. This is a story about power, not about faith. It is a story about what happens to an institution when it becomes too wealthy to be ignored and not powerful enough politically to defend itself. The Templars had spent their entire existence dependent on papal protection and royal favor. When the Pope was dependent on the same king who wanted the order destroyed, that protection evaporated. Jacques de Molay, standing in front of Notre Dame in 1314 and retracting his confession knowing he would burn for it, is one of the most striking individual moments in medieval history. Whether it was an act of genuine conviction or of pride, or of a man who had already decided he had nothing left to lose cannot be known. What is known is that he did it, and that the organization he died defending was gone within the year. The treasure was never found, because there was no treasure in the sense the legend imagines. The legacy is not a secret order or a hidden bloodline. The legacy is a banking system that made crusading economically possible, a military institution that held the line in the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries, and an institutional history that tells you more about medieval finance and royal politics than about any of the things the conspiracy theories think it's about. The actual story is good enough. It always was.